President Zelenskyy has announced that he would be willing to step down from the presidency if it meant that Ukraine could secure a spot inside of NATO. Just how does this fit into the larger negotiation scheme? Plus, is President Trump trying to end the war in 3 days? Just why is he putting himself on a timeline? And is he getting not just his dates, but also many of his numbers wrong as well? We're going to talk about that, plus a whole host of other stories, including U.S. stocks tanking, even as European and Russian stocks rise. Just how is Trump managing to shoot the U.S. economy in the foot while the rest of the world seems to rise? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this, I think, is the most relevant story. Zelenskyy has announced he will step down as president if there is peace in return or for NATO membership. This is a very interesting take, and one that I want to point out is not something dictators do, FYI. Now, part of this is what he sees as urgency, securing his country's future amid an ongoing war. And it's meant mostly to highlight the need for Ukrainian security guarantees, right? Because one of the things that Ukraine maintains, and that I think the historic record bears out, is that a Russian promise isn't worth the paper it's printed on, right? They violated not just the Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a pinky promise from Russia that they would always totally respect their sovereignty. That deal, by the way, lasting just 25 years before Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimea and Donbas regions. Then, of course, you had 3 consecutive Minsk Accords, all of which were violated by Russia and Russian-backed separatists. So for Ukraine, they're sitting there and saying, listen, any deal with Russia, it cannot rely on Russian goodwill, or Russia and Putin totally not going to try anything this time, bro. Like, I totally will do it this time. It's like asking your degenerate roommate who never pays rent, saying, okay, man, I promise you I'll get you your rent next month. I totally will, dude. Just cover my rent this month, right? That's not worth anything. What Zelenskyy says he needs is a security guarantee, right? That would be like the roommate version of saying, okay, man, but like our third roommate is going to hold the keys to your car so that if you don't pay me, we get your car and sell it, right? Something like that. A guarantee that ensures that if Putin non-complies with the peace deal, then you're going to see immediate dire consequences for Russia. And that is a really tall order, unfortunately, because again, as we've talked about, when it comes to actually putting up meaningful weapons and military contribution, or particularly putting their skin in the game, Europe has really been an 8 out of 10 in terms of talk, and more like a 6 out of 10 in terms of real concrete military support, right? Now, speaking of NATO, of course, Zelenskyy reiterated that membership in the alliance would be the cheapest option for guaranteeing Ukraine's security. And this is true. He says, I don't know how the negotiations will end, but in any format, in any case, it will be on the table. We'll probably discuss it with our partners. Now, Zelenskyy also believes it's impossible to end the war within a week because security guarantees for Ukraine have not yet been discussed and there's no substantive meetings on the issue, right? So for Ukraine, again, they're like, we need some kind of guarantee that this won't happen. Russia, of course, deliberately wants to see Ukraine not have any kind of security guarantee, right? What they frame as neutrality. But again, what I want to point out to any negotiators that might be listening is that when you look at a map, you may notice that neutrality isn't really an option for countries that abut Russia, right? You could see that you're either a NATO member like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, or you're a Russian satellite state like Belarus, right? You also, of course, have Ukraine, even countries that don't abut Russia. For example, Moldova literally has a breakaway region that is Russian-backed. You also, as you pivot south, you've got countries that are, again, under deep Russian influence or contested, like Georgia. Literally, again, portions of Georgia are currently controlled by Russia. Or you have these Central Asian republics, which are effectively Russian proxy states. So neutrality is code for influenced and dominated by Russia. And so that is where sort of these negotiations are at a considerable impasse. Now, for things are not all hunky dory for the Russians, that's for sure. And one of the things that, despite what the president of the United States seems to say, Russia is not, in fact, holding all the cards, right? They have serious issues, not just within their economy, but their actual ability to raise sustained combat power, right? As we've seen over the last several years, reportedly, Russia has pretended like its casualty rates are unbelievably low. But in reality, an analysis by Medusa, one of the only independent Russian outlets remaining, has produced this handy graph depicting total number of deaths per month based on kind of a breakout of who's doing it between contract soldiers, mobilized volunteers, and convicts. And you could see, you may look here and say, wow, it appears the casualties are somewhat decreasing. I think there is some truth to this, but these last 2 months, right, November, December, and January, just throw those in the trash because they're using graveyards and officially confirmed dead. And generally, the way Russia seems to have done these things is that you're talking 60 to 90 days before death gets confirmed. So the death rates for these subsequent months are only sort of trickling in. And I think this is significant because it reflects the fact that Russia has actually slowed its pace of combat operations. We're seeing fewer Russian gains where they remain unable to retake the Kursk region, particularly given even when they relied on North Korean troops, the massive casualties those troop formations took resulted and North Koreans being pulled from combat entirely. And so this kind of collective failing, right? And you can see here is really becoming a problem for Moscow. And you can see here, this is the essentially fatality rate per deaths per 10,000 men of military age. And in Russia, military age is literally 16 to 61. But you can see some of these poorer republics have absolutely eye-popping death rates, right? This means, for example, right here, a mortality rate of 57. That means nearly 1 in every 200 men have been killed, not wounded, killed in this war, right? You're talking about here where you're looking at, again, around 1 in every 200. Out here, you're looking at nearly 1 in every 150 who are killed in this war. And here we go, the Taiva Republic, literally over 1 in every 100 men has been killed in this war. Remember, that is killed. That is KIA. So multiply that by 4, and you're looking at as little as 1 in every 25, 1 in every 20 potentially is either killed or wounded in this conflict. So these regions are absolutely getting gutted, right? And a lot of them, and you could see what's interesting is the more economically developed ones, the ones where there's economic power, they are simply not subject to this same kind of issue, right? Here, again, you're talking about a mortality rate of just 10 per 10,000 military-aged men. So I point this out because Russia cannot rely on these poor regions forever. In fact, they're going to run out of people. That's kind of the point here, is that all of these men recruited out of these regions, they are some of Russia's poorest and most desperate. And the data bears out that this recruitment rate is diminishing considerably, right? Russia, if they were really meeting their recruitment objectives, they would not need to raise bonuses every quarter, essentially, to attract enough soldiers into their cannon fodder in order to keep this war effort going. There's also been a lot of reports and rumors that Russians are actually coercing mobilized soldiers, saying that even though soldiers signed a contract with a specified end date, their commanders are simply sitting them down and saying, hey, you have 90 days left on your contract. We're giving you 2 options. One is for you to serve out your remaining 90 days in a storm unit with a 90% casualty rate, or B, you sign a contract extension remaining in service indefinitely. Those are your 2 options. And obviously, a 90% chance of death is going to look like a pretty bad deal. And so I think the takeaway here again is that Russia is not holding all the cards. They are under considerable strain. And the only reprieve they've gotten is a strengthening ruble and rising stock valuations, literally because there are rumors that the Russians are going to get a favorable peace deal in the near future. And so this is one of the reasons why that these kind of weird Trump signaling devices where he just sort of says random shit that may or may not be true, may or may not be credible, may or may not be what he says the next day, it still tends to feed a bunch of hope and optimism. And really, you can run an economy on hope and optimism for a long time before reality comes and hits you over the head. Now, before we talk about some of the questionable numbers coming out of the president's mouth here and the real numbers of U.S. support to Ukraine, as well as some other just kind of crazy statements, I want to mention that if you want to support me, keep me independent, keep me able to do this every single day, you may notice that I was pretty critical of the previous administration in the White House. I'm pretty critical of this one. I'm not exactly out here making friends, and sponsors aren't exactly beating down their door to work with me. But I don't need them. I have you guys. You guys have my back over on combatvetnews.com. Works just like Patreon, where any one of these tiers gets you access to the Tuesday and Thursday uncensored video drops. Plus, you get access to the entire archive of uncensored combat footage going back to the start of the war. So if you're interested in that and keeping me independent and supporting me, you want to do it over on combatvetnews.com. The link is in the description. Okay, let's talk about this. So Trump, in a sort of freewheeling press conference, expressed a lot of consternation. He said, we gave the Ukrainians $350 billion in aid. That's preposterous. And then a statement later, literally the next sentence, he said, yeah, we gave them the $183 billion in aid. Sounds utterly preposterous, right? And this is because it is, again, here's the exact quote from one of his tweets or truths or whatever. Zelenskyy talked the United States into spending $350 billion to go to a war that couldn't be won, which again, we've talked about this. This is not true. Russia is really far away from achieving any of its major war objectives and is really facing potentially a defeat that never had to start, a war that he, without the U.S. and Trump, will never be able to settle. Again, likely untrue. But the thing is, when you go to literally the State Department, the U.S. State Department's own website, guys, they will sit there and tell you, this is January 20th, 2025, right? So Trump's own State Department says that we spent a grand total of $65 billion in military assistance and $69 billion in military assistance since Russia's initial annexation in 2014, right? They also say they've used emergency presidential drawdown authority 55 times to provide Ukraine military assistance, totaling $28 billion from DoD stockpiles, right? And the drawdown authority is worth noting because that is shit you have lying around. You might remember, again, I know attention spans have shrunk somewhat, but you may recall the U.S. military was involved in two other conflicts, actually, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And despite leaving a huge amount of equipment for our enemies to annex when we fled Afghanistan, in fact, there is still a lot of wartime material sitting in U.S. stores that we don't really have a particular use for. For example, MRAPs, right? These are vehicles that were fielded to resist Taliban and insurgent IEDs, and they're very effective. But the U.S. military said, hey, these were kind of a patchwork, a stopgap solution that we used for 10 years. But now we need to come up with a new, more capable, more broad-ranging sort of behind-the-line combat vehicle. And so they're like, well, what do we do with these old MATVs? They said, well, why don't we send them to the Ukrainians? And that's been true of tons and tons and tons and tons of gear, literal tons. 55 occasions, that has been worth about $28 billion. But again, it doesn't mean... It literally isn't the same thing. It's saying, hey, this is like saying, hey, I've got an old car that I can't get to run. I spent $30,000 on it when it was new, but now it's just a junk Camry that I'm never going to drive. So is it fair to say that when you give it away, you're giving away $30,000? At most, you're saying, oh, I'm giving away whatever you could sell it for now. But the truth is that what are you going to sell an MRAP for? Probably nothing, right? So you're looking at most $90 billion, meaning that the president was off by a magnitude of about 3 to 4 times. And this should trouble you because again, this is the president of the United States. Shouldn't he know, at least, as a savvy businessman, shouldn't he actually know what he spent on something, right? Like, isn't that like basic business 101? How do you do a profit and loss if you literally don't know your costs, right? So this is the kind of thing when I talk about unforced errors, right? This isn't 5D chess, because someone playing 5D chess would be able to rattle those numbers off like that, right? And so, but this doesn't mean that he's totally wrong. I want to point out that, for example, Ukraine's foreign minister agrees that, yes, Ukraine plans to end the war this year. Now, does that mean that they're going to achieve the administration's objective of ending it in 3 days? No. Or this week? No. Because Ukraine has said, the United States, whatever you agree with Russia, has nothing to do with us, right? We are the combatants. It's hard to say. It's like having a coach in an MMA fight, or a random fan or a person in the corner say, "Oh, I'm going to decide who won the fight." And it's like, no, dude, the two fighters, like, a fan cannot tap out on behalf of their favorite fighter. Okay, just because you're a fan of pick your fighter, right? Islam Makhachev, doesn't mean that you can sit there and tap out for him and say, "Duh, he's got you, Islam," right? Islam would be like, "No, dude, I'm the fighter. I decide when the fight ends, not anyone else," right? And so that, I think, is the core problem. But Ukraine itself is acknowledging, right? He said, "It's time to fasten our diplomatic seatbelts," this is from Zelenskyy, "and not give in to emotions." Their Ukrainian spokesperson said, quote, "We are convinced we really have a chance to end the war this year," right? So, again, Europe gets a vote, Europeans get a vote, Ukrainians get a vote. There's a lot of people who get a vote. And it's not just between the US and Russia, despite what Trump may believe, right? Now, two other stories that I want to point out. The first is this little map here. I think this is interesting. This is the net gains to the US and Russian stock markets since Trump has taken office. You may note that there's a lot of red, that US stocks have actually been down, right? And this is probably because generally investors are risk averse. And when you have someone like Trump who is making huge amounts of changes, right? Throwing a bunch of, for example, hundreds of thousands of government employees out on the street, there's a fear that that's going to create a major economic downturn for the United States, right? You can't just, generally, in economic downturns, they occur when lots of people are fired. In contrast, right, there's been a resurgence in the Russian stock market, and that is because primarily there's the prospect of sanctions being lifted. The prospect of at least if the United States were to lift sanctions on Russia, that would really be a boon for natural gas and mineral companies like Russia has. They also point out that European and Asian markets also climbing, up to, and many European defense contractors are up massively. Again, likely because there's a forecasting that says that Europe may continue to support Ukraine single-handedly and consider themselves fully responsible for their own defense. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had. Thank you so much to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmerling, Brian Kelly, Del McCombs, Jay Ola, Henry Roosier, all of our lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.